The lender of last resort is running out of answers. There is a moment in every empire's financial history when the institution designed to hold the system together becomes the clearest evidence that the system is breaking, not through scandal, not through corruption, but through something quieter and more permanent: irrelevance. In 1944, the architects of the post-war economic order gathered in a small resort town in New Hampshire, Bretton Woods. They had just lived through the worst economic catastrophe in modern history. They had watched the gold standard collapse. They had watched competitive devaluations shred trade relationships. They had watched nations beggar their neighbors in desperate attempts to export their way out of depression. And they had watched what came next. Not recovery, war. So they built something, a set of institutions designed to prevent that sequence from ever repeating. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, a dollar pegged to gold, a system of fixed exchange rates, a framework that would give every nation a backstop, a lender, a set of rules that would hold when private markets failed. For 3 decades, it worked. Not perfectly. Nothing works perfectly. But the system held. Trade expanded, economies rebuilt. The great powers competed economically rather than militarily, and the institutions at the center of that order, the IMF above all, carried genuine authority. Nations feared IMF conditionality. They feared it because they needed the money, and they needed the money because there was no alternative. That is the sentence worth remembering. There was no alternative. The first crack appeared not with a crisis, but with success. By the late 1960s, American prosperity had become a problem. The United States had spent decades exporting dollars to rebuild Europe, to fight wars in Asia, to maintain military presence across the globe, and those dollars had accumulated in foreign central banks, in private vaults, in reserve accounts that foreign governments were increasingly reluctant to hold. Charles de Gaulle understood this before almost anyone in power. France began converting its dollar reserves to gold, systematically, deliberately, not as an economic decision, as a political one. De Gaulle understood that the dollar's privilege rested on a fiction, that every dollar could be exchanged for gold at $35 an ounce, and that the fiction was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. He was right. On August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon closed the gold window. The United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold, unilaterally, without consultation. Without the approval of the institutions that had been built specifically to govern such decisions. The IMF was not consulted. The fixed exchange rate system it existed to maintain simply ceased to exist. And the institution designed to be the guardian of monetary stability watched as the anchor it was built around was cut loose. This is not ancient history. This is the founding trauma of the current monetary system. And it has never fully healed. What followed 1971 was not collapse. That is the fact that confuses most people looking backward at this moment. The system did not break. It adapted. The dollar remained the reserve currency, not because of gold, but because of something more durable and more dangerous. Inertia, network effects, and the absence of alternatives. Trade in oil was priced in dollars. Global commodity markets settled in dollars. The SWIFT system moved dollars between banks. Central banks held dollars because everyone else held dollars, because you needed dollars to buy the things dollars bought. The IMF adapted too. It shifted from managing fixed exchange rates, which no longer existed, to something more ambiguous. Crisis lending, structural adjustment, conditionality programs that required countries to cut spending, open markets, liberalize capital flows, in exchange for the emergency liquidity that kept them from default. For 2 decades, this worked. The 1980s Latin American debt crisis, the early 1990s Eastern European transitions, the 1994 Mexican peso collapse. The IMF arrived. It brought money, it brought conditions. Nations complied or appeared to comply, and the crisis passed. The institution had authority because it had something no one else had. The money? Then came 1997. The Asian financial crisis began, as most crises do, with something that seemed manageable. A currency peg in Thailand that couldn't hold. The baht devalued, capital fleeing. A regional contagion that moved faster than any previous crisis because capital markets had been liberalized, partly on IMF advice, and money could now exit as quickly as it had entered. The IMF arrived in Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea. It brought money, it brought conditions, fiscal austerity, interest rate increases to defend currencies, structural reforms, the standard toolkit, and the standard toolkit made things worse. Raising interest rates in the middle of a capital flight crisis didn't defend currencies. It destroyed domestic economies. Small businesses couldn't borrow. Workers lost jobs. Poverty spiked. In Indonesia, the economic collapse was so severe it ended a government that had held power for 30 years. The IMF's conditions had required cutting food and fuel subsidies. The removal of those subsidies sparked riots. The riots ended Suharto. This is not a retrospective judgment. Economists were making these arguments in real time. Joseph Stiglitz, then chief economist of the World Bank, the IMF's sister institution, publicly criticized the fund's approach. He was not a fringe figure. He was a Nobel laureate who had access to the internal analysis. He said the IMF got it wrong. The IMF said he didn't understand. He won the Nobel Prize in economics 3 years later. The Asian crisis planted a seed that would take decades to flower. The nations that suffered, Thailand, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, drew a lesson from 1997 that was precise and consequential. Never again depend on the IMF. They began accumulating foreign exchange reserves, massive reserves so large they would never again need to borrow from Washington in a crisis. South Korea went from needing an IMF bailout to holding reserves that could fund its own bailout and those of several neighbors. China watched all of this and drew the same lesson at scale. By the mid-2000s, Asian central banks collectively held trillions in foreign exchange reserves. These reserves were not held because economists recommended them. They were held because political leaders had decided that IMF conditionality was a form of sovereignty loss they would never accept again. The institution had lost something money couldn't replace: trust. Not from Western governments, who still controlled the IMF's voting structure, but from the nations most likely to need it, from the economies that had grown fastest, from the countries that, by any measure, represented the future weight of the global economy. They had alternatives now, and the existence of alternatives changes everything. In 2009, something happened that received almost no attention relative to its significance. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, began holding annual summits. What started as an acronym invented by a Goldman Sachs economist to describe high-growth emerging markets became a political project. The stated goal was reform of global institutions, more voting power for emerging economies at the IMF, more representation at the World Bank, a monetary system that did not depend on a single nation's currency. The reforms came, slowly, partially. The United States Congress delayed for years approving modest IMF voting share increases. When the reforms finally passed, they gave China more voting weight, but still less than Belgium and the Netherlands combined. The message was received. China's response was not anger, it was construction. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, a network of bilateral currency swap lines between central banks, mechanisms through which nations could access liquidity in a crisis without touching the dollar system. None of these institutions has the IMF's scale or experience. That is not the point. The point is that they exist. The point is that when a nation faces a crisis today, it has a phone call it can make. That is not to Washington. It can call Beijing. It can draw on a swap line. It can seek infrastructure financing that comes without conditions about labor markets and fiscal deficits. The conditionality that gave the IMF its power has become a reason to avoid the IMF. And the institution has not found an answer to this problem. The clearest signal of this shift is not found in press releases or diplomatic communiques. It is found in the data on who borrows from the IMF and who doesn't. The nations turning to the IMF today are not the rising powers of the global economy. They are the fragile states, the heavily indebted smaller economies, the nations that cannot access alternative sources of liquidity because they lack the geopolitical relationships China cultivates or the market access that private capital requires. Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Egypt, Argentina, again. Argentina has borrowed from the IMF more times than any nation in history. It has implemented more structural adjustment programs than any serious economist believes is sustainable. Each program has been followed by crisis. Each crisis has been followed by a new program. This is not evidence that IMF conditionality works slowly. This is evidence that something more fundamental is failing. The institution was designed for a world in which the rules of the monetary system were shared, enforced, and accepted. A world in which capital flowed within a framework that major nations had agreed to maintain. That world does not exist. What exists now is something without a clean name. Call it fragmented monetary order. Call it multipolar finance. Call it the post-Bretton Woods system trying to figure out what comes after the post-Bretton Woods system. The dollar remains dominant. No one is disputing that. The euro has never challenged it. The yuan is not ready. There is no ready alternative. But dominance is not the same as unchallenged. Central banks are diversifying reserves slowly, at the margin, into gold, which cannot be sanctioned, into currencies that provide geopolitical alternatives to dollar dependence. The share of dollar-denominated assets in global reserves has been declining for 2 decades, not dramatically, but consistently. That consistency is the signal, not the speed of change, the direction of it. And the IMF sits at the center of this shift, not as a cause, but as a symptom. The institution is expanding its lending, increasing its facilities, creating new instruments, proposing reforms to its own governance. None of it addresses the core problem. The core problem is that the institution derives its authority from a monetary system that no longer functions as designed, is governed by voting structures that no longer reflect economic reality, and is trusted by the nations that most need trust the least. There is a historical pattern here that predates the IMF by centuries. When Venice dominated Mediterranean trade in the 14th century, its financial institutions, its banks, its trading houses, its credit networks, had authority because Venice had naval power, mercantile relationships, and no credible competitors. When those competitors emerged, the authority didn't disappear overnight. It eroded. The institutions remained, the instruments persisted, Venetian ducats continued to circulate. But the underlying power that gave those instruments their value, the network effects, the trust, the absence of alternatives, had shifted. By the time Venice's decline was obvious to observers, the shift had already happened in the structure that sustained the institutions. The institutions were the last thing to go. They always are. Because institutions carry inertia. They carry the accumulated agreements of the period that created them. They carry the bureaucratic weight of decades. And they carry the genuine belief of the people within them that the system they serve still functions as intended. The IMF is not staffed by cynics. It is staffed by people who genuinely believe in the mission. But belief in the mission cannot substitute for the conditions that make the mission achievable. And those conditions, a shared monetary framework, universal dollar dependence, the absence of alternatives, are precisely what is eroding. Empires don't lose financial authority because their institutions become corrupt. They lose it because the world changes around the institutions, and the institutions cannot change fast enough. The IMF was built for 1944. It was adapted, inadequately, for 1971. It was exposed, painfully, in 1997. It is being circumvented, systematically, today. None of this means collapse is imminent. None of this means the institution will cease to exist. What it means is that the lender of last resort, the institution designed to hold the system together when private markets fail, is increasingly the lender of last resort only for the nations that have run out of other options. And when the institution that holds the safety net can only help those who have no other net to fall into, you are no longer looking at a functioning architecture. You are looking at its outline, the shape of something that was. History has shown us this moment before. The moment when the institution persists, but the authority it represents has already moved elsewhere. The Bank of England held global financial authority long after British industrial power had peaked. The pound sterling remained a reserve currency decades after the underlying economic reality had shifted. The City of London kept its prestige while the empire that built it quietly retreated. These transitions are not clean. They are not announced. They happen in the gap between what the institution claims to be and what it is actually able to do. And that gap between claimed authority and demonstrated capacity is precisely what the IMF is navigating today. Not with failure, not with scandal, but with the quiet accumulation of exceptions, workarounds, and alternatives that signal to those watching carefully that the center is not holding. The question is never whether the transition happens, The question is whether anyone recognizes it before it becomes the only story left to tell, before the outline is all that remains, before the institution meant to hold the system becomes evidence that the system has moved on.